Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. On behalf of Oxford Prospects and Global Development Institute, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our In Conversation event dedicated today to the ethical, legal, and political considerations for pandemic response management. If you would like to ask your questions, please use the Q&A box section at the bottom of the screen, not the chat, please. Thank you. And now, without much further ado, let me introduce our host of the conversation, Professor Shuang-ge Wen, who is a professor at the Law School of Jilin University, and she's also affiliated as a visiting professor at Swansea University Law School. Her research specialism is within corporate law and corporate governance, and further extends to general aspects of business law and business ethics. Her work has been cited by publications in multiple countries. Excerpts of her work also appear in court judgments and highly regarded textbooks, including Brown and Casey's Corporate Governance. Professor Wen has been acting as principal investigator or co-principal investigator in a number of research projects. She is currently a fellow of the China Commercial Law Academy, and in 2018, the Jilin Law Academy selected her the top 10 legal scholar. Professor Wen, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Also for putting everything together. Also great thanks to other colleagues at Oxford Prospects and the Global Development Institute for organizing this wonderful event, for providing this wonderful platform for communication here. Now, please allow me to introduce our distinguished speakers today, Professor Jeremy Pitt and also Dr. Mariarosaria Taddeo. They are both world-leading experts on technology and ethics, which is the main theme of our discussion today. Professor Jeremy Pitt is Professor of Intelligent and Self-Organizing Systems in the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering at Imperial College London, where until recently he was the deputy head of the Intelligent Systems and Networks Group. Professor Pitt's research program focuses on a broad range of interests, including the development of formal models of social processes using computational logic and their applications in self-organizing multi-agent systems. He also has very strong interest in human-computer interaction, social technical systems, and also the social impact of technology. He has been an investigator on more than 30 national and European research projects and has published more than 150 articles. He's now a fellow of the British Computer Society, a fellow of the Institution of Engineering and Technology, and he's also the editor-in-chief of IE Technology and Society magazine. Our second distinguished speaker, Dr. Mariarosaria Taddeo, is Senior Research Fellow at Oxford Internet Institute, and she's also the Deputy Director of the Digital Ethics Lab. Her recent work has been focusing on the ethical analysis of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, cyber conflicts, and also ethics of digital innovation. Her area of expertise is philosophy and ethics of information, although she has also been working on broad issues, including the logic and philosophy of artificial intelligence. She is principal investigator of OPGDI in a number of research projects. In 2018, she was listed among the top 100 experts working on artificial intelligence in the world. She has also been awarded the Simon Award for Outstanding Research in Computing and Philosophy and the World Technology Award for Ethics. She is currently serving as editor-in-chief of Minds and Machines, published by Springer Nature. So as we all know, the entire world is currently in the middle of a very serious public health emergency. COVID-19 cases are actually still surging in many parts of the world, and in some areas are actually setting new records almost on a daily basis. But perhaps the silver lining of this pandemic is that it has brought some of the smartest people together, cooperating, doing their best to develop new technology, fighting against this pandemic, just like the two experts who join us today. So without further ado, let's just start our discussions here, perhaps with my questions first. And then if any participants would like to join the discussion, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A column. Possibly the first question for Jeremy and Rosaria is that about the test and treat systems that are currently in operation in many countries. So test and treat has definitely become one of the key strategies to control the virus and also lower the R rate, the rate of reproduction. It actually has several functions to protect people, for instance, to enable the tracing of close contacts, to give local area alerts, and also the QR when you check in thing. This actually seems like a rather simple idea, but perhaps the two experts would care to share a little bit more from your technological expertise about how this system actually works and whether there are any alternatives to the current system. So, Jeremy, if you don't mind, perhaps we could follow the lady first tradition here, and you go the second.
All right. Well, in my work, I'm much more concerned on the ethical implications, so to speak, or the ethical and social implications of how these kinds of app might work. So when the first app was about to be released in the UK, with the rest of the research group, the Digital Ethics Lab, we focused on what are the requirements that this kind of app need to respect to make sure that they will be ethically sound. And being ethically sound is not just, let's say, an academic requirement, a desiderata that scholars in Oxford in an ivory tower might think relevant. They are important because, as we saw with the failure of the first app, if the app is not deemed ethical by the citizens, then it will not be uptaken. And if it's not uptaken, then it will be a failure, a missed opportunity in terms of time, money, effort, and government reputation, so trust into institutions. So ethics was, or is in the case of tracing app, very, very relevant. So in a paper we published in Nature, we identified a number of requirements to be respected by these apps. But more importantly, we identified 4 key questions that need to be addressed and addressed successfully, I'd say, for any project focusing on developing such apps. So the first thing is understanding whether it's necessary. The key point with these apps is that they pose a trade-off between individual rights, like privacy, avoiding mass surveillance, being able, for example, to remain anonymous when in your whereabouts, and public health, and even personal health. So this kind of trade-off is a trade-off that is not impossible to achieve, because privacy is a fundamental, but it's not an absolute right. So you need to have privacy, but it's not that you either have or not have privacy. You can have more or less privacy. So it's not impossible, but it has to be done in a correct way. Legally speaking, if you think about the GDPR, for example, well, the GDPR gives provisions for cases like a pandemic to limit a little bit individual privacy in order to ensure public health or public safety. So within this context, how do we strike this trade-off? The first key thing is being necessary. So do we know that this is a solution without which we cannot do, so that this solution will save lives? Because if the answer is no, there are other solutions, there are better solutions, well, this is the first, let's say, requirement that we fail, and we shouldn't proceed forward. The other question is whether the app offers a proportionate approach, very much like in the military context. So the gravity of the situation justifies the possible negative impact. So we know that there's going to be an impact on privacy, but the situation is so bleak, so problematic, that we're willing to take this cost to improve it. And that's the case in which we can move forward. The third question is whether the app or the solution is sufficiently effective, timely, and accurate. So whether there is evidence, scientific evidence, that this solution, for all its cost, is going to work. Otherwise, if it's not based on scientific evidence, it remains problematic. And fourth, and most importantly at this point, is whether the solution will be temporary. So there has to be an explicit sunset clause, as it were, an explicit moment where, in the governance, where we say, well, once the emergency, once the pandemic in this case, will be over, tracing apps will not be in place anymore, because they pose a curtailing of individual rights, which are fundamental and can only be curtailed in exceptional emergency circumstances. But I'll stop here because for philosophers, it's very easy to monopolize conversations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's really insightful. So Jeremy, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for that. Thank you also, Joy, for that kind introduction. And again, thank you to Janina for inviting me to participate today. It's a great pleasure and an honor. From an engineering perspective, of course, there's a bit of sadness in the failure of the first version because one can diagnose some. So in the UK we've had two versions of the NHS Test and Trace app. The first version effectively failed because they were trying to apply a technology which hadn't really been used in this way before. So that was the use of Bluetooth. Secondly, there was this idea of not invented here. Yeah, so they tried to ignore existing infrastructure on which to build a solution. And secondly, they went for a centralized solution as, rather than sort of storing information on the phone. And in the fourth dimension, they actually, to me anyway, they ignored the human element of this, which was to actually rely on self-diagnosis rather than robust testing, which is just, just from an engineering point of view, not understanding the nature of the humans being involved in the technological loop. So in the second iteration, as far as I can see, they addressed a number of these problems, but are still relying on Bluetooth, which is, as Rosaria sort of mentioned, kind of an unproven technology for doing this kind of thing. So you reduced it down to the idea of encounters, but trying to work out the risk from the signal strength and the length of exposure to that signal strength, which are just two factors, because the density in the location, the ventilation in the location, many other factors that we don't actually know about how the virus is transmitted. So this basically gives us three problems. As far as I can see. One is the risk of false positives, and the second one is the risk of false negatives. As Rosaria points out, these are absolutely crucial to knowing that the technology is working as it should do. And the third thing is that it has to be seen as not as a silver bullet solution, but the fact that it is just one tool in our toolbox, and it has to be complemented with robust and reliable testing methodologies. It has to be complementary to public health messaging, so about social distancing and the use of masks. It has to be complemented by human-led contact tracing. So this is what happens after you've done the contact. And ultimately, you see, you cannot see this thing as being punitive. So you've detected that someone has been exposed, you've asked them to self-isolate, but then after that, you've got to provide them with the appropriate financial support, the appropriate emotional support, and the appropriate logistical support to ensure that the time that they spend in isolation is actually effective. And without these things, the test and trace is going to be ineffective, in my opinion.
That's really helpful. That's really insightful. Like in the subject of law, where I'm currently working, we actually say that there is actually a discrepancy about the law in books and law in practice. So I guess the same thing is also happening to technology as well, just like the test and trace. And also, perhaps my second question is connected, is a follow-up to the first question here. Both of you actually just mentioned the importance of the human element, like Rosario has just mentioned about the importance of public attitudes, public support towards the use of this, towards the adoption of this kind of technology. So definitely the effectiveness of technology in real life, as we have seen, can be affected by different contextual factors. So perhaps would you care to elaborate a little bit more on what kind of social or pragmatic factors or any underlying factors that would affect people's level of acceptance towards this test and trace and the effectiveness of this mechanism in general?
Gentlemen first, ladies first, how would you like to?
It's not up to you. It's purely up to you to know.
Ladies first.
Okay, you're a gentleman. I think there are a few points to stress. One involves a key word which is increasingly abused in the public discourse, which is trust. And there is an idea for which people, citizens, trust technology, and people, citizens, trust government. That's true, but it's true up to a point, especially when we forget that trust is something that has to be earned more than just obtained by default. So when we deal with digital technologies, when a public institutions, when a government issues a technology which is meant to track people, because it's a track and tracing technology, well, it's leveraging a lot of trust from its citizens, especially in democratic countries. Leveraging the trust cannot come without necessary guardrails, necessary and explicit transparent governance of the technology. In the first case in the UK, this was not the case because there was a focus on a centralized, Jeremy said, a centralized approach, refusal to rely on solutions which were used in Europe, lack of transparency on how this data were going to be managed, a kind of a top-down approach, deft to the values and the respect that the public opinion was pushing for. So that was a failure that was very much inside of anybody who was looking. There is a second element, which is the digital divide. So Jeremy mentioned the fact that we look at technology as a silver bullet. We call it a digital solutionism. Technology is a tool, but without a strategy, it doesn't take you much further. And for example, the track and tracing was a great opportunity, but you need to account for a country like the UK, which is still part of developed world, rich and information society. So relying on digital technology to quite some extent, still a country which has a digital divide, a divide in which access to digital technology is curtailed by economic reasons. Some people still have old versions of mobile phones on which this app, the new and the older, could not be downloaded. And cultural. There was a recent reports that showed that above 65 years old, I believe, a good portion of the population does not know how to send an email, does not know how to upload a picture online. These are trivial, simple tasks. How can you ask to those people to download an app, understand the limitations on that app, trust that app, when they don't really have this kind of education with respect, literacy with respect to digital technology? So there was a question of messaging or public message about the relevancy of this app and limits and profit and benefit. And also, you need to justify the reason why you want to track and trace. And you can only justify with respect to the gravity of the crisis. If the gravity of the crisis has been downplayed, it's hard to ask for sacrifice later on. So that's my third point.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. So from my point of view, in complementing those social and contextual factors, there's some political ones as well. And I think this is in part basically that, structural weakness due to an emphasis on an ideological form of government. So this is where you actually get a commitment to centralization rather than regionalization. So it's been quite clear that we've needed to have local government involved in the decision-making and the implementation, but they've effectively been underfunded and cut out of the loop in recent years. There's an attitude between outsourcing everything to private organizations and versus trying to get all the stakeholders involved. We don't have any corruption in the UK, but we do have an awful lot of consultancy going on in here. Yeah. The third thing is this is what happens when you get a country that basically is has to experience a lot of basically manufactured culture wars, arguments over completely confected cultural issues, so that the wearing of masks no longer is interpreted as a public health one, but a mark of which side of a political divide you're on. We also have a real breakdown in the relationship between the demos, the people, and the rulers, which I think Rosaria was hinting at. And you have a government that is deliberately exploiting and polarizing divides, with the result that you actually alienate half of your population. What this required, of course, was buy-in from the whole population. But when you've actually sort of separated it into two parts, because you're appealing one to vote for you and not the other one, you can't get that collective action to work properly. And finally, that there is a complete lack of accountability that's going on. There will not be any responsibility taken for mistakes. Now, one of the founding principles of democratic regimes is its ability to fail forward. So the whole idea of, I mean, it's been said that all political careers end in failure. Well, you could also say the same thing about all political regimes, but the idea of failing forward is that you learn from those mistakes, because it's that gives you systemic improvement. But if you've got a government that is in denial about the mistakes that it has made and seeking to blame everybody else for what went wrong, including the public whose buy-in that you actually need, this is just a recipe for failure. I mean, systemic failure.
I think both of you have just highlighted many important factors that I would like to come back at a later stage. Just like Rosaria has mentioned, the access to technology, which I think is rather important. But here, perhaps let's just follow up with Jeremy's comment first. Jeremy actually mentioned about the political side, politicizing everything and this kind of tendency, and also about this kind of, actually one of the most often heard words in discussions and debates in relation to this pandemic is actually about balance. For instance, people very often present the health against the health versus economy as a binary choice, as a zero-sum game. And the responses to the pandemic are also very often framed in terms of striking a balance between different values and different priorities. So I guess my next question is, in line with other balances that we are discussing here in the context of COVID-19, how are we going to maintain or strike a very good balance between the effective use of this test and trace and also the protection of fundamental rights of citizens, such as private data of the citizens? So, yeah.
Well, as I was saying before, the first step is to understand that the balance is feasible, because we need to understand privacy as a fundamental, but not as an absolute right. That we have regulations, I'm afraid in the EU, expressed quite clearly when it comes to the GDPR on how this balance should be defined. As long as we make this balance contingent upon the pandemic, so we're ready to revert it when the pandemic ends, hopefully at some point, not too far in the future, that's something that can be achieved. But the balance requires, let's say, a lot of countermeasures. So as Jeremy was saying before, we need accountability. So in a very simplified manner, you can imagine citizens saying, well, okay, we're happy to give away a little bit more of our privacy because of the situation. But because we also want to retain the democratic status and the respect of human rights, what are the countermeasures that you are offering government for asking us to give away a little bit more of our privacy? So transparency of processes, fundamental. Accountability, something goes wrong, we need to have it, not only for punishing those who made the mistake, but also to make sure that we understand where the mistake was done and not to repeat it. So it's a way of learning and improving the progress. A clear understanding of the benefits we want to achieve. What is the strategy? So to give an example, in the first version of the app, one of the reasons why, which were put forward for not using the distributed approach and the one that then eventually has been used, was to say that, well, we want to collect those data because epidemiologists need those data for science. Some of the epidemiologists then said, well, actually, no, because these data are not clean data and they're very much not relevant for us, especially when you don't link the app to a test, but to a self-diagnosis. So understanding the reasons why a specific technical solution is designed in a certain way, make sure that those reasons stands to the proof of science, to the proof of law and ethics. These are other important steps to designing that balance with the use of a word I don't really like, but it's very effective, is a multidimensional task. So it's not just privacy versus the pandemic. It's much more like individual rights, human rights, in a context of a pandemic with respect to the power of a government. And so it's a complex task which requires a lot of refinements and fine-tuning, but can be achieved. So I'd like to end with this positive note. It can be achieved, but it requires work.
Yeah. So if I may follow, I mean, I agree with that entirely. And of course, part of the problem is this approach that complex problems can be reduced to simplistic solutions, which is hugely problematic in the messaging. But this issue of balance actually extends not just to the test and trace, but also what happens afterwards. So of course, one of the big problems we now have, of course, is that one of the sort of medium-term solutions is vaccination. But of course, we already have a strong anti-vax movement. And one of the biggest risks here, especially given this lack of, as we pointed out, key issues of accountability, transparency, and so on, is if there is not take-up of the vaccine. And the absolutely most damaging outcome would be if there's only sort of like limited take-up, so 70 to 80% of the vaccine. The virus then still spreads within the 20 to 30%. It mutates and then reinfects the already vaccinated people. So, the uptake on the vaccine has got to be based on sound messaging and public goodwill. And here we then see the absolute downside of failing to communicate properly common knowledge and the public good. Because this is a matter now of civic education and civic dignity. There are, public health is all about balances and trade-offs. And we have to understand that this one is about an individual rights versus a public good. And that actually, you have to, in this particular case, to suppress your individual concern in order to do something which is generally for the public good, and that is getting vaccinated. This is not a new trade-off. I mean, the balance between individual rights and freedoms. Your right to swing your fist stops at the point that my nose starts. Right? I mean, this is. Something that philosophers and ethicists have discussed for centuries. I don't need to tell Rosaria about this. But in line with the development of the technology, should also be reliable civic education in terms of what we need to do to properly deal with the pandemic. So it's not just a technological solution; it is also an educational one. A public education one.
Well, indeed, I think striking a balance between civic rights and civic responsibilities is always a hard one, just like many other things associated with this coronavirus. It's not really that simple, though. Let's perhaps go back to the point that Rosario made in the previous comment about the access to technology. I actually happened to be reading news today, and I found this the United Nations Under Secretary General has pointed out, and I quote, one key cause of poverty and inequality is limited access to digital technologies. So definitely, I think gaps in digital accessibility could actually mean millions or even hundreds of millions of vulnerable parties being left behind as our life increasingly moves online. So perhaps the two leading experts in technology and ethics could care to give us a little bit of your views on the matter, like how to expand the accessibility of technology and how to effectively protect the most vulnerable parties, both during and after this pandemic.
So that's a very big question. There are a few obvious answers. One has to do with focusing just on the digital divide, so on the access to technical access to the technology. As I mentioned before, there are data which show that the UK suffers of an important digital divide. So we know, for example, that in 2018, only 78% of the population had a smartphone. And in the same year, there was 80% of the overall population which had zero digital skills, and only 12% of the population with very limited digital skills. That's basically overall about 10 million people of the UK population which has limited understanding of the digital, let alone access to the hardware. So having a computer, having a working smartphone or tablet. The solutions there, well, there are the obvious one, support digital literacy, making sure that across the different, let's say, parts or portions of the population in terms of age, in terms of wealth, there is an understanding and a literacy with respect to technology. Foster access, you can imagine, making sure that there is some form of reliable hardware or digital device per household. But I'm afraid that it's wrong to think that the responsibility to overcome the digital divide rests solely on the government, because there is also a part for the civic society. In terms, for example, and I'm referring here to something that we published in a blog from the Digital Ethics Lab, so it's information that was brought up by one of our members. In Oxford during the pandemic, there were a lot of mutual aid groups. So trying to have like more expert people, digitally and literally educated people who could help people who didn't have that kind of support, trying to bridge the divide. I think that's perhaps a less obvious solution, but it's also one that we should leverage on, especially these days, because it's the most immediate one. So relying on the sense of civic responsibilities of citizens of whatever society to make sure that, there is some support offered to those who don't understand this technology. And it's important to stress, in time of the pandemic, the digital device is not only relevant, because of the track and tracing app. It's also relevant because you do grocery shopping on internet. You access and you talk to friends and family through the internet. You might pay your bill, talk to your doctor. And these are important services that are key for the weakest parts of the population, the elderly, the people who are with a fragile health, a risk population. And those are also, most of the times, those who have less access to these technologies. So at least in the short term, overcoming the digital divide is something that is harder to reach with the governmental strategies, because that will take months. So there is a role also for the civil society here to play, as I said, especially in this next few months.
Yeah. I agree entirely. I would only qualify it by saying that you've not just got to encourage civic responsibility, but you've got to empower civic responsibility. And you don't necessarily do that by not supporting inclusion and dismissing attempts to put in broadband infrastructure throughout the entire country as some kind of communist plot, which is so the key thing is, absolutely, that in terms of addressing for digital divide from a socio-political standpoint, you've got to put government online, but you've got to put people online as well. And then, trust goes both ways. Yeah. The people need to trust the government, but the government needs to trust the people. And so they need to empower them to do this local organization and do these community building things, which have been unfortunately neglected. I would also say two other things here. From a purely engineering point of view, there is a development methodology called value-sensitive design. And I think this complements the ethics that Rosaria has been talking about very well. And the idea here is that you're not just building a system because you want it to do some kind of function, but there's actually some kind of qualitative human value that you need to promote. And the whole idea of value-sensitive design is to put those values as primary design requirements alongside the functional and non-functional requirements that you normally have. So we really need to encourage that. And in part because that leads up to onto the follow-up that Joy asked about, which is about protecting vulnerable groups. And so I've got two things here that I think we really need to be concerned about. The first one is just the notion of the public interest. So this has, I think, been a theme that's been coming up in both my answer and Rosaria's answer. Yeah. And that we actually need technology which is informed by value-sensitive design, so that we can actually start building systems which empower people to understand and take control of matters which are of public interest. Okay? So it's really important there that it's quite clear to people what problems are trying to be solved, how this affects them, why the technology is being introduced, and why decisions are being made. And of course, this pulls us back to all kinds of issues about accountability, transparency, and so on. The second thing, I think, is that we are storing up a huge mental health crisis that's going to follow on from the public health crisis of the pandemic. So it was definitely the case that technology companies were trying to get people hooked on using their products. There's this notion of addiction by design in gambling, for example. So what techniques could be used in digital systems to actually get people to continue to gamble? And a number of these techniques were then picked up and used to get people using their devices and their apps. And this is only going to have been exacerbated while people have spent more and more time, for those who have been fortunate enough to be online, spend more and more time online. This is just like recovery from long COVID, where people have long-term symptoms. We're going to have to deal with this problem too. And so in particular, protecting the vulnerable groups, it's a group of young children, or this generation that is actually living through this pandemic and had to move their lives online and interact through screens, having their education disrupted, having their formation of social relationships totally disrupted, having their employment prospects totally disrupted. And they need sensible solutions, constructive solutions. It's these people we need to support as well.
Indeed, and I think the answer may not just lie in the field of technology, just like both of you mentioned. Perhaps it lies in economic development and everything as well. And as I can see that in the Q&A section, there are actually two questions, and both are connected to your comments about vaccine and also about the balance between individual rights and public goods. So perhaps we could the two speakers would care to address the questions here. Just let me read out the questions for you. Would public education be effective in the short term to convince the skeptics to give up their individual rights for public goods? Would it require too long? And also complementing that, is there such thing as an individual rights to not to be vaccinated?
Yeah, if I may, Rosario, I'm sure you have. So if we take these, of course, there's an individual right not to be vaccinated. The point being that this is the whole the issues that are studied in public health, the trade-off between the effectiveness versus other issues like expense, human rights, and so on. Yeah, one could argue that in this particular case, the issue is so important that there should be a compulsory, mandatory vaccination in this case, because, as I say, it's either all or nothing. Yeah? And the same thing, would public education be effective in the short term? I mean, it is a really interesting one, that, because of course we are actually backing up against two things, and I'd like to come on to it maybe later. But we oversaw a transformation in the way that we disseminate information from traditional gatekeepers like the schools, the universities, and the media, to allow any random voice to shout on the internet, and so and collect voices. Maybe we can come back to that, but I mean, this is the issue that we face here.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of framing it. There are 2 points that I'd like to stress. That indeed there is a right not to be vaccinated, but the rights becomes very relevant in context of adverse circumstances or in context of risk and safety. There is no friction between public interest and personal interest when both things, or let's say the vaccine is meant to support individual and public health. So the frame is there to balance the individual and the public interest when there are two interests that are a conflict one with each other. Let's assume that the vaccine is not something that is there to be risky for the individual and good for society, but that it's there to be good for the individuals and the society. So the balance there doesn't need to be put in place because there is nothing that is in friction one with the other. And there is one other thing which I like to stress. I'm not sure, it might be something that is not received well, but there is a point in which in society, and going back to what Jeremy was saying, we have decoupled the understanding of the truth from the decision that we make. We live in a post-truth era, right? So when you have a public debate and about economy, and you hear about chief economist or world-leading economist, and then from the random guy at the pub, and we take the two opinion in the same at the same level. This is problematic. So there was one of the questions in the chat, I think, say, why should we trust public institutions when they have misbehaved so much in the past? I am a scholar, so I'm biased, but I still believe the science does not make political decisions, but offers a good understanding of the matter of the world. And we should follow science in making political decisions. So if there is a vaccine, we should believe in the fact that there is a vaccine, which is effective and not detrimental to individual health. And that's something that has to be kept solid in the public debate, because shaking the truth of science takes the world in a kind of a medieval oscurantism, in which we should make sure don't end up at all. And just a fun quote, Jeremy, to what you were saying. There was at some point a US Supreme Court judge who decades ago said that the internet has made us all pamphleteers, and that's very true. I'm not sure. I mean, we're seeing the positive and negative effects of this impact of technology.
Right. interesting. There's a third question in the Q&A, given a history of corporate and government representation. This, of course, is precisely the point that, of another quote, as you sow shall you reap. Yeah. So if you are consistently exposed as misrepresenting things, inevitably you will pollute the well of common knowledge against yourself. So I have limited experience of lockdown and approach to pandemics in 3 countries. So that's UK, Hong Kong, and Sweden. And the approach in Sweden was completely different because the demos, the people, trust the government, right? So whatever the government recommended, the people were going, okay, this is what's being suggested, we'll follow it. And that's because the Swedish government, of whichever hue, haven't deliberately followed policies which are clearly based on misrepresentation. They don't go around campaigning by putting lies on the side of a bus, for example. Okay, I mean, this is absolutely fundamental. If you want to avoid this kind of breakdown in relationship between the demos and the people, and the thing about this is it's actually because a particular art form has been undermined, and this is rhetoric. So rhetoric used to have 3 aspects to it: logos, ethos, and pathos. Yeah? And the idea of this was that you're looking for signs. Yeah, basically the logos. Did this person actually make sense? Is this a rational thing to do? Second thing was even if it's a rational thing, can I trust this person? Yeah. I mean, is this a reliable source? And then the third thing, of course, being can you actually take that group with you? Are you showing the kind of leadership that is necessary by example, such that people will say, yes, okay, I can follow you with this? And of course, you don't achieve that sort of thing if, sorry to be specific about it, but if your special advisors don't follow the rules that they themselves set down. I mean, you're basically pulling the carpet out from underneath yourself.
That's really insightful. I guess this is, I guess both of your answers actually connect to my next question that I was about to ask, which is actually about the thing of trust during this pandemic and also in the post-pandemic era. So how do you foresee that technology and also the pandemic would affect and transforming the substantive qualitative human values such as trust, particularly in the post-pandemic era? Because both of you have mentioned about the trust between government and people, and the trust towards public institutions are being a very crucial component. And also I noticed that both speakers have written extensively about trust being a crucial component of human-artificial agent connections. So perhaps you would like to elaborate a little bit more about, just to wrap it up on the theme of trust here.
Jeremy, go ahead.
So I think that there are 2 things here. There are always 2 things here. Yeah? So one, I think there's a lot of short-term initiatives which can be looked at. So there's the whole idea of design contractualism. So this is where engineers make ethical choices and encode that in the system, and their ethical decisions are then made visible in the interface. Yeah? So you're actually giving the appropriate signals. A lot to do with Tim Berners-Lee's initiative about linked data to give people far more control and ownership over their own data. I have seen and mentioned several times the kind of Hippocratic oath for ICT, information communication technology practitioners. Very interesting article by Joshua Bengio, who won the ACM Turing Award on making moral choices about the use of deep learning and applications of artificial intelligence. There's the whole issue actually of informed consent that needs to be looked at, and that when you make one of these contracts, the terms and conditions, which are just this huge, great thing, I can do anything to you, but actually, we need to turn that back on its head, to say, these are my rights and you have to respect them. And that's not just for privacy, but that's also for attention, and also for data itself, for knowledge, if you like, that you need to know that it's not just who's saying you something, it's where do they get it from? Why is that being thrown at us? And this is why the various technological solutions, my own one, I'll just advertise this, but it's called Platform Ocean, where we're really trying to empower communities and make sure that they can keep all their own data within the platform. The second thing on the issue of, sorry, I'll give it back to you in a moment. Technologists are just the same as philosophers once they got the token. It's quite clear that you can actually exploit the automation bias, this is distinctly problematic when you get complex situations like this, when people start delegating cognitive skills to the machine. And this is one of the things that we're seeing with the voice-activated video assistants, that the generation growing up with these things, find it, although they have the mental capacity to deal with the problem, they start outsourcing it to one of these, Vava, Siri or Alexa or whatever, And that might be okay when you start sort of saying, asking questions like, oh, Siri, what's 4 + 4? Okay, you can work it out, It starts getting slightly different when you start saying, well, Siri, should I get myself vaccinated? Or Siri, who should I vote for? And and the thing is, it turns out that you can actually exploit the automation bias to people to get undermine their own decision-making skills. So you can set them situational judgment tests, and if they make a certain decision, you can get them to reverse it by saying to them, well, in the previous answers you said this, computer actually thinks you should say this. And you can get people to change their minds. And so we really actually have to be very, very careful about the way that we are deploying this kind of technology with respect to trust.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So, Rosemary, it's up to you.
The question is very broad, and Jeremy brought up so many interesting points. There are 3 things I would like to say. The first is that, following on from what Jeremy said, artificial intelligence, digital technologies more broadly, they have great potential to improve our lives. They are improving our lives. And I would like to stress this point because we focus so much on the negative input that we forget that we can work, we can get educated, we can talk, we can develop science much better than we would have without digital technologies. Having said this, they come coupled with important ethical risks. One of the key risks stays in the decision to rely on these technologies, to think that AI is the silver bullet, digital technologies are the silver bullet, to overuse or misuse or underuse AI. So there is a process in which the trust in this technology has to be questioned at the very beginning, when we start thinking about what solutions we want to have to any given problem. So that's the first point. The second point is about trust in and on itself. So this is a concept, an easy word, which actually refers to a very complex concept that philosophers, psychologists, ethicists, economists, cybersecurity experts consider in a completely different way. But there is a common element. At a very high level, trust is a way of delegating a task and choosing not to control how the task is performed. And this is important because it makes trust the facilitators of social interactions. So, I don't control the way a doctor makes a diagnosis about his patients or her patients, and I delegate the task to him. In that way, I save time and energy to do my own job. And you can imagine this for many, many factors in societies. There is a question, though, that with this relation between the lack of control and delegation, if there is too much trust, then in societies we lose accountability because you lose any chances to perform control. If there is too little trust, the system doesn't work because you have to check everything. So it's a balance that has to be struck there. But there is another element to trust, which is often trivialized, which is the trustworthiness of the trustee. Now, the words don't sound very well put together, but basically it's the assessment of the other agents you just decide to trust. Now, trustworthiness, because of some literature that has been circulated around, is usually conflated with the idea of reputation. So someone has been able to perform that task until now, they will be able to perform that task later on. That's true only in part, because there is another element which is overlooked but is key, and is the risk. When I assess the trustworthiness of the trustee, I'm not only considering whether Anne, Bob, Alice are able to perform the task, but also the risk that I'm taking if they don't do it. And the same action might be more riskful in a context and less riskful in another context. Assessing their risk is a responsibility that the trustor has. So we say that in societies, those whom we trust needs to gain the trust, and that's very true, by improving and showing a responsibility, reputation. But we have a responsibility to understand the risk that we're making when we trust. And so that means being informed about the people you vote, making decisions which are fully informed and aware of the consequences when we decide to go on through some avenues or other avenues, the kind of news you read. So I'm generally skeptical about the concept of empowerment, but because it tends to offload bigger responsibility on the lay persons. But this is a responsibility as citizens, as members of societies, of the human societies we have. So making responsible choices with respect to trust, because there is a risk to it. And when we all start trusting, well, the risk is shared across the population. So yeah, I wanted to stress these 2 points.
Thank you both very, very much. That's really helpful and that's really insightful. I guess just like Rosario has mentioned, I think the answer is multidimensional again, isn't it? Sorry. I think the time is almost up. So just one final question from me, a quick one, okay? I guess there is the question about cooperation in the post-pandemic era. So this pandemic definitely is an unparalleled crisis, but there are also opportunities for people to cooperate at an extraordinary level. So we have seen active academic exchanges and collaboration going on despite this COVID-19 outbreak, just like what Oxford Prospects and Global Development Institute has been doing here. So in what technological fields do you particularly feel the significance of active collaboration, possible international collaboration? And also, since the three of us, and I assume most of the audience are also working in research institutions, perhaps what more could the research institutions do in terms of enhancing this kind of collaboration?
Okay, I'll give the trivial answer, okay? So I think that there is one area which certainly has become clearly more, let's say, benefiting more from the urge from collaborating, which is healthcare, biology, genomics. These are areas where the sharing of data is crucial and has been for many years problematic because of previous reasons. During the pandemic, the urge to coordinate, to push forward human understanding and science has made possible to overcome some of those frictions in an effective way. There is another area which is not science, but is very important, which is politics, policies, and economy. If you look at the European Union, the amount of fundings that the member states have been willing, well, there's been like some hookups, but more because of some member states in these days, but the will to support countries which are more poor or more problematic has come forward quite stronger than he ever was. And then there is another element which I really hope the pandemic might push forward, which is the environmental sciences and the fight against climate change. We see it in Europe again with the Green Deal and the use of digital technologies to support the Green Deal. This is another area where I hope, I mean, there is a strong element to this pandemic which is related to the climate change or the way we exploit this world. So there might be a lesson that we might eventually learn. But I'll stop here because I'm sure that Jeremy has much more insightful comments.
No, probably the same comments actually. So I would entirely agree with this. So I'm not sure necessarily this is development, but it's certainly an issue of regulation. But alongside the pandemic of virus, there's a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. And we really need to find a way of regulating or developing the technology to address that. In more general terms, we can see this thing as actually having 3 phases. So there's treatment, rehabilitation, and prevention. And Rosaria exactly says there's lots of things that we can do in terms of the technologies coming together for the treatment and in the medium term for rehabilitation. But I would completely agree and endorse what Rosaria says about prevention, because what actually has to happen is that we've really got to give more emphasis to supranational organizations like the World Health Organization to really look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, pay attention to some pretty shocking industrial farming practices to limit the possibilities of this ever happening again.
Thank you both so much. May I just take this last opportunity to thank our distinguished speakers for your very wonderful, informative, and also insightful comments. I thoroughly enjoyed this session, and I think I actually benefited a lot from this. I hope that our audience are actually feeling the same. Also, may I just deliver special thanks to Dr. Wang Shidong, to Janina, to Richard, and also other colleagues working at OPGDI, also to my colleagues at Jilin University for organizing this special event. Without your support and efforts, this could not have happened. So if we don't have any further comment from our 2 speakers, I hope that all of you enjoy the rest of your day, and all of you have a very, very nice weekend.
Thank you so much for chairing this meeting, for organizing.
Yes. Thank you very much for everything. Yeah.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I hope we could actually meet up again very soon in person in the UK or in China. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's hope. Thank you, Professor Wen, for staying up so late. I know it's almost 10 o'clock in China, so thank you for your time. Thank you, Professor Pitt. Thank you, Dr. Taddeo, for sharing your insightful comments with us and thoughts. And also thank you to all the audience for your participation and the questions. And at this point, please let me allow you to invite you to our next In Conversation event, where we will be discussing the cultural exchange inherited from times of uncertainty. And it will take place on Friday, the 4th of December, at 12:30 UK time. So please don't forget to register for this event. And thank you once again for your wonderful discussions. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.